están?
Pues, ¿en inglés lo
¿todo bien? Voy así, les voy a decir que me perdonan, que voy a hablar en inglés, ya que mi español es más informal, es entre familia. So, a little bit about myself. I began working for President Obama at the age of 21 and worked at the White House until very recently, until our change of government. And the focus of my work was really identifying ways that technology could be applied to policymaking and to improving the government-citizen interaction. So what I want to talk about today is how we can use technology to regain trust and build empathy in our large institutions, particularly our bureaucratic institutions. So for too long, we have thought about technology as existing in a silo. So in government especially, the status quo was to write a policy, have the policy people decide how it would be implemented on behalf of the public without ever asking the users of these programs what they might want, and then handing it to a contractor or an engineer and saying, build this. For anyone that was monitoring healthcare.gov and the failure of our healthcare website back in 2013, this is exactly what happened. 80 distinct contractors were responsible for building one website for a policy that they didn't understand without anyone acting as an intermediary between the government policy and the policymakers and the contractors that were responsible for building it. So something to know about engineering and technology is that this work is important. It's not simply about, technology and Silicon Valley and startups building cat apps and on-demand laundry services, right? This is actually critical to the foundation of our democracy and how our government runs. It's not enough to just call in the tech lady and say, something's broken, come in and fix it. We need people there at the very beginning. Because while technology is not going to fix everything by itself, it absolutely can be an instrument and will be part of the tools kit that we use for implementing and designing better policy and empathetic institutions at scale. So, trust in government is pretty low right now. There are about 14 governments where the population that believes that the systems are failing them is above the global average. So, it's not great to start. The global average of people who think that their governments are failing them is 53%. But in the United States, it's 57%. And in Spain, according to Edelman, it's 67%. This is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for our governments to be better, to be more responsive, and to understand that there are ways for them to improve trust with the public. So what can we do? Well, I'm going to talk about 4 ways in which I identified that government misses opportunity for building trust with the public. It's listening, being transparent, taking action, and behaving as advocates. Andrew McLaughlin is the former Deputy CTO, Chief Technology Officer at the White House, and he said exactly what I said a few minutes ago, that technology alone won't solve any problems, but it will be a part of the solution that will solve human and organizational needs. This is also about fighting cynicism relentlessly. So when we see those numbers of people who just feel like their government is not listening to them, that's actually hugely problematic, right? Our governments are not going away, nor should they. So they need to be better about, and we need to feel better about how our government is serving us. So the first one, listening. My first job at the White House was in the president's mailroom, the Office of Presidential Correspondence. President Obama received tens of thousands of emails, faxes, hard paper letters, and phone calls every day from the public of people who were telling him how they felt about the economy, about their mortgages, about healthcare, veterans writing about the VA, about the Department of Veterans Affairs and their own benefits. And this was the true ear to the public, because if you're invited to the White House for a meeting, you've already surpassed a bar, right? Like somebody knows you, you're influential in some way. And so this was the only way that the White House was getting a real pulse of how the public was feeling about our policies, both good and bad. And President Obama said this, that constituents like feeling heard, like their elected representative is paying attention and is responding to what they're saying. But here's the thing. The White House had a policy of only responding to letters that were written to them in English. And when I first arrived to the Office of Presidential Correspondence, I asked them why that was. And the response that I got was that we only had an obligation to respond to our citizens. And I said, many of our citizens speak other languages that are not just English. And what you're doing when you don't respond to them is sort of just leaving them out to dry. And so, for example, the census, the US Census Bureau estimates that by 2050, the United States will be the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. Our government has not gotten the memo that pretty soon they're going to have to start translating all of their forms and all of their information for the majority of speakers in their country. So I had to go through a few bureaucratic hurdles first, changing the policy, which is we should not only respond to people in English, using the logic that that's because we're responding to our citizens, because our citizens speak other languages aside from English. And we should make sure that everyone that is writing to the president feels heard. So once I went through and I got the policy hurdles dealt with, I then began working with my team to rebuild the algorithm and the rules engine that they were using for categorizing and reading English correspondence and translated it to Spanish, Italian, French, and Portuguese. And in 2013, President Obama became the first president to respond to a letter that was written in Spanish, to read it, have it translated, and respond. This is from 2016, and it's his last proclamation to workers for Labor Day. And it's written in Spanish. And this is hugely important, that people who are reading correspondence, official memos from the president feel like they actually can understand it and internalize it in their own language and feel like it is actually woven into the fabric of our government. The second, transparency. So I don't work at the White House anymore for other reasons. But this is something that even when I worked for President Obama, felt incredibly frustrating because we consistently missed opportunities to just be transparent, to continue to build that trust. So an example, in 2014, President Obama established the task force to protect students from sexual assault on college campuses. At the time, this was coming up quite a bit. There were a few high-profile cases of students who had been sexually assaulted, and the university had not taken any responsibility, or they had acted poorly in how they were dealing with the accusations. Every college campus, every university receives some funding from the Department of Education through a policy called Title IX. And Title IX basically means that they have a responsibility not to decide whether somebody is guilty or not, but to take certain steps after an accusation has been made. For example, allowing that student to switch out of their dorm rooms, allowing them to switch their course load if the person, their accuser, is in their classes. And so the only thing that the Department of Education actually cares about is whether they follow those rules or not whether somebody is innocent or guilty, right? That's up to the university and to law enforcement to deal with. But here's the thing. We actually have very poor data around sexual assault on college campuses, and we also know that sexual assault is really, really underreported. And so the data that we do have is not only flawed, but it's definitely missing a huge percentage. So President Obama coordinates this task force to protect students from sexual assault. I served as the tech delegate to that task force, along with a few of the federal agencies, the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services. And they said, well, what can we do to be more transparent about what is happening? And so rather than decide amongst ourselves what we thought would be helpful, we coordinated a group of student survivors who had sort of brought up these accusations on their college campuses. It was, of course, anonymous. We wanted to make sure that they were protected, but we invited them to the White House and we asked them what would be most helpful, what they would have wanted to know at the time, and what we can do as a government to better serve these students. And one of the things that they said is, when I reported, it went into a black hole. From that point on, I had no idea if they were doing anything about it. When I wrote to the Department of Education, I had no idea if they were doing anything about it. And it would be great if I knew which universities were under investigation. This, of course, became a huge political fight. The Department of Education and the Department of Justice said, we can't just let everyone know if schools are under investigation. And I said, why not? We're not, again, saying whether they're guilty or not guilty. We're not saying if Stanford, for example, is guilty or not guilty. We are simply saying that they are under investigation. And in the United States, you are innocent until proven guilty, and so that can perhaps create, give them some peace of mind. Because I'll tell you, in 2016, for the previous year, what is the percentage? 91% of universities said that there were 0 sexual assaults on their college campuses. I don't know if the number is 1 or 1,000, but it's not 0. So what we did in May 2014, for the first time ever, was release the 55 schools that were under investigation for Title IX violations. And we didn't, say if they were guilty or not guilty. We simply said, these schools are under investigation. This is important for students to know, for their safety and peace of mind on college campuses. It's important for parents to know who are sending their children to universities, perhaps in the next year, where they're leaving a university in charge of the safety and well-being of the people who they love most in the world, their children, and so it's perhaps helpful to know this information. Before President Obama left, because this list has not been released since, over 304 investigations were pending at over 223 colleges and universities. And on the day that we ran it for the first time, ESPN wrote about it, and it took down the Department of Education's website. They had never seen, so first, they were clearly not stable or built for scaling, but they had never seen so much traffic or interest at the Department of Education's website until this moment. So transparency. The next, action. So when we've listened, when we've gone out to our users, like these students, or when we're listening to the public when they write to the president, what is the number one thing that we can do to show them that we've listened, that we have taken what they've said seriously? Well, that is doing something about the thing that we've heard, right? So someone says, this process is very hurtful for me. It's very confusing. It's complex. I'm having a hard time navigating it. You, as the government, are responsible for making sure that this process is seamless for me, is easier than it is today. And so it's incumbent upon us then to take responsibility and to take action based on what we've heard. And how do we do that? So the number one thing that we did at the United States Digital Service was attempt to redesign government systems. This is a very high-level overview of the immigration system in the United States. And if you were to zoom in onto any one of those, you would see a million more boxes pop up of possible options in the lottery that is immigration. And what we heard from people was that it felt like when they were, and so we worked on visa modernization and we worked on improving online immigration benefits. Over the course of 10 years, from 2002 to 2012, the Department of Homeland Security attempted to build online applications for immigration benefits. It took them $1 billion and 10 years to produce nothing that worked. When they finally launched in May of 2012, their online application system was just a PDF. I could have done that for them for free. And it was slower than the paper process for the people who were actually going through and adjudicating these forms. So everybody started complaining, everyone had a meltdown, they shut it down and went back to paper $1 billion taxpayer dollars later. And the one thing that we heard was that the mostly paper-based immigration process felt like a black hole for the people who were applying. And if anyone here has ever applied for a visa to the United States or for an immigration benefit, you can raise your hand. I won't tell on you, don't worry, I'm not. But you perhaps know firsthand what this feels like. When you apply for a US visa, your form switches hands between agencies 6 more times before you receive a decision. And what I mean by that is that the paper literally gets mailed around the world 6 more times for somebody to review before a decision is made. And it feels like a black box, right? One of the most important things that you're applying for in your life, if you're attempting to become a US citizen, if you're wanting to go abroad for school, if you are applying for an H-1B visa, and it just feels like a black box where you submit some paperwork, you have no idea if it was received, you have no idea if you did it right, and you have no idea if the next phone call is going to be, hey, great, come in for your interview, or you did this all wrong, it's time to get back on a plane. Literally, this is what people who are applying for immigration benefits are dealing with every single day in the United States, not knowing if one missed form is going to result in their deportation. So, specifically, we wanted to spend some time on the gap between people who are eligible to become citizens, legal permanent residents, and why they do not. There's a high percentage of people who are actually eligible for citizenship that don't apply. We went out and we interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people who are legal permanent residents, and we asked, why haven't you applied for your citizenship yet? And the number one reason that we got was a fear of failing the naturalization exam. So a few things to know. One, if you fail a naturalization exam, you can take it again literally the next day, but it costs money, so we don't want that. We want people to feel like they have the tools and the resources to pass on the first try, knowing that if they don't, that's fine. Most Americans wouldn't pass it either. But here's the thing. A lot of people who are legal permanent residents also don't speak English as their first language, as the language that they feel most comfortable learning in specifically. And so something that we did was create the civic exam online and translate it into Spanish. This is another interesting policy hurdle because I think the point that I want to get across is that it's not technology alone, it's also existing policies and laws and regulations that make it incredibly difficult. And so I wanted to just build the form in Spanish with no other English text on the page. But a bunch of lawyers told me we couldn't do that. And so we settled on this, which is English with the subtext in Spanish translation. And the number of people who were using this literally skyrocketed overnight because previously it was in English, also not in very great format. And we got to a point where we were seeing thousands of users where previously we had seen in the tens, maybe less than 100. Another thing to know about this is that the 88 possible questions that appear on the naturalization exam that have not changed, I think, ever, are actually cycled through here. There are only 10 questions on the practice exam, but if you were to take this practice exam enough times, you probably would see all of the questions that would possibly come up on the exam. So it's critical, people have mentioned human-centered design. It's critical to go out into the field and listen to what the public is telling us. And this is not just US citizens, right? The US government does not only serve citizens, we serve people around the world. And it's critical that we go out and we listen to what people need and that inform what we build with them, not for them, with them, hand in hand throughout the process. And finally, advocacy. So the government frequently misses the opportunity to behave as advocates, except that we are. We provide critical lifeline services to the majority of the country, from food stamps to financial student aid, housing vouchers, everything that you could think of people needing to meet their daily needs, the government provides. So another chart from the Edelman 2016-2017 Trust Barometer. We are seeing that trust in the 4 major institutions, the private sector, nonprofit, media, and government, generally are decreasing. They're not doing well. But especially now, for me now, as I transition away from the White House, and as I think about how I'm going to meet the needs of the most vulnerable, it's important that I take everything that I learned working in government and begin to use it to support the NGOs, to support the nonprofit sector. This is my favorite quotes. If it's inaccessible to the poor, it is neither radical nor revolutionary. Some of our hardest problems to solve are people problems. And so you have a lot of really wonderful and fantastic engineers and engineering companies and MIT and Stanford working on some really progressive, really exciting technology, like the self-driving car. Unless we can think about how the self-driving car will meet the needs of the poor and the vulnerable, how it will assist with public transportation, it actually doesn't matter that much, because what that means is that that gap between those who have the means and those who do not will continue to widen. So what I'm up to next, taking everything that we learned in government and applying it to building a public interest technology sector. There are a few organizations that are doing this, right? Code for America, if you're familiar with Code for America in the US, and all sorts of civic tech organizations. But the problem is that right now that ecosystem is incredibly fragile. It requires on people going out and doing person-to-person recruiting and saying, hey, did you know as an engineer or a designer or a product manager that this is a space that you can work in? And much like public interest law or communications, we are not building up a generation of engineers who just know that the nonprofit space or government could be a good fit for them and for their career paths. So I'm starting a new organization under a foundation called the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., that is focusing on building all of these best practices to the nonprofit sector. And our first projects work across these spaces: financial inclusion, mapping the opioid epidemic. Opioids are killing over 40 Americans every single day. It is now the leading cause of death in the United States, and we have no idea why the things that we're trying simply are not working. And so identifying interventions, using data to identify interventions that are working, and then using technology to pick them up and bring them to other communities and apply them is critical. It's actually life-saving work that the government and now nonprofit space need to be doing. Of course, we're going to continue working on immigration. We're going to work on improving the foster care system. Right now, in the United States, I'm not sure how the foster care system works in Spain, but in the United States, most of it is run on paper and index cards. So how we do our matching for children who now need to go into foster care homes is done entirely off of an Excel spreadsheet in alphabetical order, just social workers calling and calling and calling and seeing who has space in their home, as opposed to sorting by perhaps what would be most helpful to that child, like staying in their school district. Which homes are available at the school, in the school district where they go to school, so that 8 hours of their day are not completely turned upside down along with the rest of their lives, so they can begin to find some places of stability. And so I'll leave you with this. For whoever saw the Pope's TED Talk, which was amazing, it is critical that as we think about innovation and science and technology, that we spend some time thinking about how that is going to apply to social inclusion and more equitable distribution of services for the people who need them most. Otherwise, like I said, it doesn't really matter, because our problems, the question of how are we meeting the needs of the most vulnerable, don't actually go away. They don't become minimized. They are actually amplified. And that's it. Thank you all very much.